that they could take Kyiv in a matter of days. They miscalculated the determination of the Ukrainian people, and they underestimated the resolve of the European Union and the international community. Ukraine has inspired and continues to inspire the world. A few weeks after the initial invasion, I spoke in the name of the members of this European Parliament in Kyiv, in front of the Verkhovna Rada, and besides President Zelensky. I made a promise on behalf of all of us that we would stand with Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. In the past 2 years, Europe has kept that promise. We will keep that promise still. Our political, economic, military, financial, humanitarian and diplomatic support has remained steadfast. The European Union is the largest financial supporter of Ukraine, with €88 billion provided so far. We are ramping up our EU defence industry's production capacity to provide Ukraine with over 1 million artillery rounds by the end of the year. An agreement on the additional €50 billion Ukraine facility, pending agreement on the multiannual financial framework, was also reached last night. Funding that is crucial for Ukraine's survival, recovery and reconstruction. We know the sacrifice that the Ukrainian people are enduring. We know they endure it for their sake and for all of Europe, for our collective security, for our shared values, for our way of life. The European Parliament was the first to call for Ukraine to receive EU candidate status, and we were the strongest advocate for EU accession negotiations to start last year, because we know that Ukraine's place is within our Union. As we enter the third year of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, I want to use this moment to renew this promise that we made to the Ukrainian people. We are with you and we will remain with you. Slava Ukraini! I give the floor now to the Council, to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, European Affairs and Trade and Federal Cultural Institutions, Minister Hajj Al-Habib.
Madam the President of the Parliament, Madam the President of the Commission, dear Commissioner, Honourable Member of the Parliament, the passionate debate we just had is certainly linked to the fact that we are celebrating and approaching to this very, very sad anniversary. Indeed, almost 2 years ago, Russia, driven by the anachronistic urge to redraw, to redefine maybe the map of Europe to satisfy its expansionist ambitions, launched a full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, bringing the war back to Europe. And let us remember that Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a clear violation of the Charter of the United Nations and the fundamental principles of international law. For almost 2 years, it has been causing enormous human suffering in Ukraine and causing or exacerbating global crisis, inflicting considerable damage on the global economy. This war is today one of the main threats to peace and stability on our continent and far beyond. In the face of this immense challenge, Europe has shown unity and determination. Since day one, the European Council has provided strategic guidance for the European Union's response and taken decisive action. The EU has thus strongly condemned Russian aggression and played a fundamental role in efforts to isolate Russia on the international stage. In addition to unwavering political support, the European Union, led by its member states, has provided an extraordinary level of humanitarian, financial, economic and military support to Ukraine. And let me elaborate one of the main aspects of this unprecedented effort. D'abord, je dois souligner que notre aide à l'Ukraine
I must emphasize that our assistance to Ukraine is not only continuing, it is also increasing. As President Charles Michel has just said, last week an extraordinary European Council gave the green light to additional assistance to Ukraine to the tune of 50 billion euro for the period 2024 to 2027, thanks to the Ukraine facility. It is right now vital to finalize this package, which allows for stable long-term assistance to Ukraine, and I thank the European Parliament for its constructive work in the trialogue, which led to an agreement in principle last night. This is an agreement which puts as long as it takes into practice and helps to secure a future for Ukraine and its population. There is 31 billion in budget support and humanitarian aid and 25 billion in military assistance, and we have increased humanitarian assistance and civil protection assistance, which is benefiting 10 million people in Ukraine. We have also received on our territory more than 4 million Ukrainian refugees, with their protection extended to March 2025 following a unanimous decision by the member states in October of last year. This assistance has some consequences, and I appreciate the solidarity corridors, which we should keep and which we should improve to guarantee continued export of Ukrainian grain and agricultural products in order to lessen the risk of famine. All of our energy today and tomorrow must be centered on our unity, our long-term cohesion, and the opening of accession negotiations with Ukraine is a very important signal both to Ukraine and Russia. As far as the European Union is concerned, Ukraine's accession to the EU is only a matter of time, and the clock is ticking. As we assist Ukraine, we continue to weaken Russia by means of sanctions. We're hoping to finalize a 13th package of sanctions on the symbolic date of 24th of February 2024. Council has used the European Peace Facility to deliver 5.6 billion euro in assistance in the form of military equipment to Ukraine. We need to speed up the delivery of munitions and missile in order to ensure that Ukraine gets 1,155mm shells from us as soon as possible. We're only on 524,000. That's not what we promised, and we need to do better. The European Union and the member states are working closely with Ukraine and a very large number of countries who are seeking a just and global peace under the aegis of the United Nations. We support the Ukrainian peace formula, and we're ready to work for peace. We're ready to cooperate in the Summit for Peace, to work on the Ukrainian peace plan put forward by President Zelensky. The European Union remains utterly determined. Our determination must be unwavering. The future of Ukraine and the future of Europe depends on it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. I now turn to the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Go ahead, Madam.
Mr. President, Madam Minister, honourable members. In any fight, it is always the side fighting for something that has a higher power on its side. It is the one who believes in what they are fighting for, that will sacrifice and do what it takes to prevail. And conversely, it is the side who fights against something that will always be scared, scared to lose, scared to think of the future, scared to speak out. 2 years ago, Putin and Russia started a war against something, a war against Ukraine and its territory, but also against the people and a nation with an iron will and hope for the future, against their European aspirations, against the values they share with us, and quite simply, against both modern reality and the strong tides of European history. And in doing so, Putin started a fight against all of us, against freedom, self-determination, and democracy at large, against everything that we have stood for over 70 years. Ukraine has proven the power of a nation and the people fighting for something. For themselves, first and foremost, but also for us and for everything that we believe in: freedom, democracy, rights and aspirations. Some were surprised by Ukraine's heroic action, but no one should have been surprised that when faced with oppression, subjugation and tyranny, they chose resistance. And that is why, honourable members, I remain just as convinced of one simple fact today than I was 2 years ago standing in front of you, and that is that Ukraine will prevail and that Europe will stand with Ukraine every step of the way. Honourable members, we have spoken in great detail over the last 2 years on the EU's historic and massive support for Ukraine, be it military, financial or human, be it on sanctions, security or the single market, be it on the historic path of Ukraine to our union that this House has been such a strong supporter of. But today, on this poignant anniversary debate, it is a time to look deeper at how we have got there and where we must go. The starting point is that Ukraine and Europe have shown that we are willing to fight and pay the ultimate price for the things that we believe in. And this was one of Putin's greatest miscalculations in that month of February, as he amassed troops on the border and planned a quick lightning strike on Kyiv. Mr. Putin, you made this mistake because you cannot understand what drives the human spirit when it is free to think, dream, create and prosper. Nor can you understand because you cannot bear to accept that the human desire for freedom will always win. And honourable members, Putin cannot understand that if you give people a choice, they choose liberty once and for all. And in Ukraine's case, they fight for liberation. He cannot understand that the fight of the Ukrainian is different to the fight of a Russian soldier whose lives Putin has callously churned for a past long gone and a future that could never exist. Ukraine's sacrifice is the opposite. Why do they fight? Because they are battling, toiling for something existential and inherent to the human condition. This is why Ukraine's will is not just stronger than Russia's. It is fundamentally different in nature and in character. And this is what Putin will never comprehend about us. This is why his invasion was not just morally, but also strategically wrong. He cannot understand freedom and why we fight for it, because his only instinct is to crush what he fears. And this explains what has happened in the last 2 years. Instead of toppling Kyiv, dividing the European Union and weakening NATO, The exact opposite has happened on each and every count. With the support of the European Union and our allies, Ukraine has not only held firm against a bigger country, a bigger army, and a bigger economy, but it has retaken more than half of the territory that Russia occupied from the start of this conflict. They have knocked back Russian offensives last winter and are doing the same now. And this indomitable spirit is what we have to keep in mind here in Europe and right across the democratic world at this juncture of the war. There's no time for wavering. There's no time for navel-gazing. The message Europe sent at last week's European Council was crystal clear. And let me repeat it here. Europe will be at Ukraine's side for every single day of this war and for every single day thereafter. Honourable members, keep up our momentum to support Ukraine and to protect our own future. That means thinking about reconstruction, about security commitments, about strengthening the international system to avoid any repeats or reruns. It also means continuing to support Ukraine in every way we can. Take military support. So far, we have trained over 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Our Union and Member States have mobilized 28 billion euros worth of military equipment. The European defence industry has increased its production capacity for ammunition by 40%. We will have delivered over 500,000 rounds of artillery shells by next month, more than 1 million by the end of the year. But this is certainly not enough. Not only must we accelerate the delivery of ammunition to Ukraine, as we look to the future, we must think of Ukraine's defence capabilities as part of our defence capabilities. We must think of Ukraine's defence industry as part of our own defence industry. And this is why we have involved Ukraine in the preparations of our own defence industrial strategy. It is a first step which should lead to integrating Ukraine in some of our defence programmes, with the agreement of the European Parliament and Council where necessary. This would not only help us cater for Ukraine's defence needs, it will also encourage convergence and joint planning between our militaries and defence industries. Ukraine is a future member of our European Union, so it must get much closer to us also in the field of defence. And this leads me to my third and last point on Ukraine's path towards our union. The contrast with just 10 years ago couldn't be starker. Back then, a pro-Russia regime in Ukraine was passing authoritarian laws and killing protesters on the streets. Today, this country has just given itself new legislation to expand national minority rights, to improve the judicial system, and to ensure checks and balances on power. And this is what led us to launching the accession negotiations. And this progress is happening not only because Europe is asking for it. This is the deep desire of the people of Ukraine. Ukraine is Europe because Europe is in the hearts and in the minds of Ukrainians. And soon enough, Ukraine will also be in our union. Honourable members, the anniversary that we mark today is a tragic loss of human lives and suffering. And it is all the more tragic as we know there will be more pain and more suffering ahead. We know how much is at stake here for those in Ukraine and also for the rest of Europe. Putin's fantasy and fabricated war and Ukraine's heroic resistance has reminded us here that our freedoms and our democracy are worth fighting for it. So today, we pay tribute to those who are fighting, and we pay tribute to those who paid the ultimate sacrifice in fighting for something. Slava Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Commission President von der Leyen. And the first speaker is Ms. Rasa Jukniewicz-Nie. Please.
First of all, thank you, Madam President, for your strong leadership. Ukraine has shown a miracle. Let's remember the first weeks. How many here believed that Ukraine would stop the Russians at Kyiv? 2 years of this war have also shown a miracle of European unity. We know what we have already done by standing together. Today, we have to talk and agree on what is needed to win this war. First of all, the front needs even more support now, today, this particular minute. Second, we must believe that we can win this war. We, the democratic world, are many times stronger than Russia. The economic power is incomparable. However, the EU-wide support to Ukraine is only 0.075% of GDP per year. Is it really an indicator that shows our understanding of Europe's existential war? Third, we must not be afraid of Russia, just as the Ukrainians are not afraid. We must not be afraid of Putin's blackmail and the defeat of his regime. Putin must lose. Fourth, we need a comprehensive plan for the victory of Ukraine. This requires a vast development of the EU defense industry. Now is the time for the European Union to get its act together on security. A defense union is needed as never before, but I see such union only together with Ukraine in EU and in NATO, with its army, which is clearly the strongest army in Europe today. The victory of Ukraine will be the victory of the whole Europe. Only victory can solve the historic Eastern dilemma in Europe. Slava Ukraine, long live Europe.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next speaker is Mr. Pedro Marques, please.
Thank you, President, Madam President of the Commission, Council, colleagues. 2 years of this war, more than 700 days of suffering in Ukraine. In each of these days, people were killed, children lost their lives or their parents, families were destroyed by the brutal attacks of Russia. In each of these more than 700 days, the brave Ukrainian people stood against one of the most powerful armies in the world, showing their courage and their will. But make no mistake, courage and determination can only do so much. We know that. Ukrainians need the ammunition and they need the financial support to win the war. The Ukraine facility is long overdue. And Minister, the MFF review is still not there. We should have come to this moment proclaiming that we are with the Ukrainians in every single day of the war with an agreement on the MFF review. And the money is still not there. So I please ask you, to the Council, to the Presidency of the Council, there's a message that needs to be clear. Trilogues are not monologues. This Parliament does not accept this idea on the economic governance, on the MFF review, that the trilogue is simply a monologue. So please bring back that message, because we need an agreement. We need rapidly to have an agreement to support the Ukrainians, so that our proclamations are followed by the money that we have promised them and that is still lacking. Let us deliver on this fight for liberty. Let us agree rapidly on our support to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marques. Next speaker is Mr. Patras Austrevicius, please.
Mr. Chair, Madam President Commissioner, Madam Minister, dear colleagues. A day before, I spoke with a colleague in Ukraine who shared the following observations. I quote, "Only a strong Europe with strong defense capabilities can stop Russia from continuing on its war path. The war in Ukraine only gives us, Europeans, time to properly prepare. Russian society has been enslaved by Putin regimes and is part of the war machine. It is therefore important that Europe's security challenges are properly understood by our citizens, especially by the young people who will continue the fight against Eastern totalitarianism. End of quote. 2 years into the brutal war in Ukraine, my friends' observations sound like a clear manifesto for Europe, calling for solutions to be fully implemented. Yesterday, we concluded trilogue negotiations on Ukraine's facility, but the amount of our support for Ukraine needs to be multiplied. So must European defense capabilities. Only in this way can the threat to Europeans from Russian fascism be averted. Slava Ukraini and Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Austriavicius. Next speaker is Ms. Viola von Kramon-Taubadel. Bitte.
Thank you, President. Madam President of the Commission, colleagues. First of all, we said Ukraine would fall in 2 days. After 2 years, the country is still there. For too long, peace in this continent is considered to be a given. That changed in February 2022. We are reminded that peace is based on military strength to defend us and our allies. Since the start of the invasion, Ukraine has won back the Black Sea and ship routes. We have Russian ships hiding in the Black Sea because they're afraid of Ukrainian drones. For this fight for our freedom, Ukraine is paying a high price. Putin is sending murderers out of the prisons, sending them to the front. Ukraine is losing its best people. Every death is too much. This year, Ukraine will get back its airspace so that Russians can't be terrorizing children in their sleep. But Ukraine can't do any of that without our help. Every time, if Washington doubts, Russia steps up its attack. Every time when Berlin wobbles, the Russians fire more rockets. Every time Orban blocks aid, more Ukrainian children are deported and killed. Nothing encourages the Russians as much as our weakness. If Ukraine falls, EU member states are the next on the list. Putin likes nothing more than our weakness and doubts. The other thing which separates us and the threat are the courage of the Ukrainians. So the accession of Ukraine isn't just some value, it's in our own security interests. We say, as long as it takes, but this means to give what is necessary, so that as long as it takes, doesn't take 2 more years. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau von Kramon-Taubadel.
Thank you very much.
Frau Anna Fotyga.
Miss Anna Fotyga, the next speaker.
Państwo przewodniczące, koleżanki.
President, ladies and gentlemen, in order to survive, in order to have the advantage of the West collectively, both militarily and economically, we must support Ukraine because it's bleeding and fighting in our name. It needs to be done now, unconditionally, without pretending things, without treaties being changed, the budget being changed, small member states being blackmailed. What we need is political will which will overcome anything and everything. Well, I have little hope for that, but hope dies last. So perhaps I will see positive results. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Fotyga.
Thank you, Madame Fotyga. Then we have Mr. Jean-Paul Garot next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The situation in Ukraine deserves all our attention. However, it should not lead to situations which are detrimental to our own nationals. Integrating Ukraine in the EU would pose a threat to our farmers in France, and there are particular dangers there. Since the start of the conflict, the EU has ceded to all Ukrainian demands, particularly when it comes to free access for their poultry and cereals to European markets, and we've sacrificed our own farmers. The most fervent supporters of Ukraine, such as Poland, have had to put up barriers against the entry of Ukrainian cereals, given the deadly threat that that has posed to their own agriculture. In 2018, Ukraine was the 5th largest maize producer and the 8th largest wheat producer in the world. This is a threat to our producers. Ukrainian producers depositing their wares in Europe can cause their European Ukrainian goods to reach all over the world. 5,000 tons of poultry arrive in Europe every year, priced 4 times lower than production in France. Ukrainian producers do not respect our standards, and they can be found in our distribution chains. Macron and his cronies in Paris claim to defend our agriculture. But next June, this customs exemption will expire. We have to ensure the survival of French and European agriculture. And we will see who will vote for what. Thank you.
Monsieur Garot, nächste Rednerin ist Frau Özlem Demirel.
The next speaker is Ms. Özlem Demirel.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much, President. 2 years, that's how long the war has been going on in Ukraine. And you think that, in every debate here, you think that that all you're talking about is battlefields and weapons, but war has its facts. It's evident that the offence in Ukraine has failed, but nonetheless you're calling for weapons. Has the Putin regime it has the blood of Ukrainian children on his hands. Ms. von der Leyen and Mr. Biden and Mr. Johnson, they don't have clean hands either, because there were negotiations for a ceasefire. Mr. Zelensky stood here at the start and was in favor of a ceasefire. NATO said, keep fighting, you're fighting for our freedom. And that is cynicism. Why don't you let people in? Why do you let people in Ukraine die for your freedom and your geopolitical interest? And saying that, tell your story about people being attacked. No, the men in Ukraine don't have freedom to withdraw from war. The women and children who are afraid of their families don't have the freedom to withdraw from the war. Do something for peace. That is solidarity. That is human rights. That is freedom. War is never freedom.
Demirel.
Thanks, Mrs. Demirel.
Massimo Castaldo.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. 2 years, colleagues, 24 months of bombs, terror, innocent people suffering just to satisfy a tyrannical criminal regime. It's a moral duty for us to rally our forces to defend them, but also it's an existential question for the future of the EU. Thank you for those clear, strong expressions of commitment, Ms. von der Leyen. This is what we need. The €5 billion increase for the European Peace Facility should be deployed now. We need it now to get munitions to the front. All those frozen assets should be transferred to Kyiv to help the resistance now. We've seen what Viktor Orban wanted to do. Article 7, and whatever means we have at our disposal, need to be used now. Our union has to defend all Europeans. Putin should see that we will not hesitate. We will defend the sovereignty and freedom of Ukraine with all of our strength, and very soon Ukraine will be the 28th member state. There is no Ukraine without the EU. There's no EU without the Ukraine either. Slava Ukraina.
We are running a bit late, dear colleagues, so I ask you to respect the allocated speaking time. Next speaker is Mr. Michael Gala.
President, colleagues, Szanowni Ukraińcy. 10 years of war, 2 years of full-scale war waged by a war criminal in the Kremlin. The Ukrainian nation stands united and refuses to be subjugated back into the servitude of a Russian gulag. The EU also stands united behind Ukraine, and we are not alone if we look at the Rammstein format of almost 50 states who help in multifaceted ways. I'm proud as standing rapporteur for Ukraine and as a co-rapporteur for the Ukraine facility that we concluded the trilogue on the Ukraine facility yesterday evening as part of the revised multi-annual financial framework. But we can forget about all these good things that we have foreseen if Ukraine is not enabled to defend itself and push back the aggressor towards its own borders. We need to support Ukraine in this regard not only as long as it takes, but with whatever it takes. And that is why I support the suggestion of the Estonian Prime Minister that said that every EU member state should provide 0.025% of its GDP for weapons deliveries to the country. President Macron
has spoken on several occasions about France's support up until victory. Fine, but French arms need to be supplied to the same extent as German arms are.
Given the doubts of the German Chancellor, we have a call on the German Bundestag, deliver Taurus now. There's a majority in the Bundestag for that. Germany isn't a one-man democracy. Don't be afraid of your parties on the left. Let's face up to Putin. Let's stand up against the empire of the evil, which threatens our way of life. Slava Ukraini.
Speaker is Mr. Sven Mikser, please.
President, dear colleagues, 2 years into Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine, what can be said? One thing is for sure, Putin has failed. His blitzkrieg has failed miserably. He has not managed to break the resolve of brave Ukrainian soldiers, brave Ukrainian people, or of the democratic world that continues to stand with Ukraine. And indeed, somehow Mr. Putin has even managed to double the length of his country's border with the NATO alliance. So Putin has failed, but we are yet to succeed. We have said over and over again that we would stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. But let us be clear, how long it takes depends directly on how much we give and how quickly we do it. So we must give more, and we have to do it now. Let me repeat what I have said from this stand before. If all of our member states and all our transatlantic partners were to pledge on a sustainable basis just 1/4 of 1% of our GDP for the support of Ukraine's war effort, it would make a crucial difference. It would help to end this war and hand the Russian aggressor the decisive defeat it deserves. And this would be the best gift we could give to our continent's future security and prosperity.
Merci, Monsieur Mixer.
Thank you, Mr. Mixer. I shall ask Nathalie Loiseau to come forward, please.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, the European Summit of 1st February was a success because it confirmed our financial aid to Ukraine. But let's face it, as far as our military aid is concerned, the summit was a failure on several counts. The 8th tranche of European military aid has been blocked for months because of Hungary. The future of a visible and predictable European peace facility for Ukraine is uncertain. Nothing has yet been decided, and above all, no funding has been clarified. Instead of taking action and making decisions, our countries are accusing each other of not doing enough, when they should all be doing more, much more, and faster, much faster. The ammunition plan is not living up to its promises. 500,000 rounds of ammunition delivered to Kyiv is half of what was announced. Above all, it's woefully inadequate. So, please, I appeal to all European leaders. For Ukraine, for the security of Europe, you have a duty to rise to the occasion and you've not yet done so. Never forget, failure is not an option. Complacency is not a method. Slava Ukraini.
Next speaker is Ms. Alvina Alametsa, please.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, lähes 2 vuotta.
About 2 years of war. That's 2 years too much. The Russian attack on Ukraine is an attack on Europe. The rule of law and peace. 2 years is the same. Also a sign of the toughness of the Ukrainians. They have stood it out. We must too. The EU must increase its financial and military aid to Ukraine so that they can win. 50 billion euros in aid is important. I demand that the 200 billion in frozen assets of the Russian single central bank should be used in full for the benefit of Ukraine. We must train soldiers in Ukraine and find out new ways how we can help them straight away. 2 years, about 200,000 Ukrainians have died or been injured. We won't forget. We won't give up. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alametsa. Next speaker is Vice President Robert Zīle, please.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Minister, Vice Chair. The good news for Ukraine, of course, is this 50 billion support. But let's be honest, the military assistance from the member states is not sufficient. And we are late, especially some member states are hesitating. We are not being able to deal with the confiscation of the seized Russian assets. The system has not been perfect also for avoiding sanctions. And the EU businesses are still using all kinds of export commodities from the Russia and profit on that. Why am I saying this? Because time is of essence. We cannot help Ukraine sometime in the future for a certain amount. We thus endanger the nation of Ukraine, the language of Ukraine during this time. The Russification aims are being achieved by Russia. Meanwhile, there was a prominent conference in Riga last year against the genocide against the children in Ukraine that are being that are being stolen and taken away. Also during the Soviet times, Russia was implementing this Russification attempts, but they did not extract children from the families. But now these children, within 2 months, could lose their ties with Ukraine and language and everything. And if we want to help them, then time is of essence, and we can only help them by providing full military assistance as soon as possible so that we don't lose time and don't lose the nation.
Much, Vice President Zīle. Next speaker is Mr. Anders Brindale Vistisen.
Some planning.
The mixture of financial assistance for the Ukrainian war and the EU membership is harmful. We shouldn't deny things. If the Ukraine becomes an EU member, it means more criminality, more social dumping, more welfare tourism. For Denmark alone, the costs will be 26 billion in every budget period. 26 big hospitals, that's the equivalent. So it will be EU membership for Ukraine will be a disaster for us. If we should help Ukraine, it should be weapons here and now. Denmark has provided more of that than most of the member states here. And this is all the more important when you compare that with the prospect of Ukrainian membership of the EU.
Eva Ruiz, please.
Gracias, Presidente. Thank you, President. 2 years after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, this war has escalated, leading to a numerous negotiation project. Is the situation better today? Are we closer to peace? No. Thousands of lives have been wasted. The dependency on humanitarian aid, 4 million people are displaced in the country. We have 6 million refugees outside Ukraine, a public debt of 90% and a 70% of GDP debt to the IMF, destruction of infrastructure, a destroyed political system. These consequences have reached Europe too: increased inflation, energy prices, food prices. Not everything has been lost in these 2 years, though. The US has doubled its exports of gas to Europe, and its companies are seeing multi-million-dollar profits. The EU and this Parliament is responsible for this too, because our only response to the conflict has been to defend the US interests and not European interests here. Enough. This is a failed strategy. When will we stop? Will we give the US companies concessions to reconstruct the country? There is no time to be lost here. Thank you.
There's a blue card. Would you accept a blue card from Mr. Bütikofer, please? Yes. Mr. Bütikofer, please.
You advocated a whole lot of anti-Americanism. I didn't expect anything else. You advocated a whole lot of anti-Americanism here. I didn't expect anything else. But are you not ashamed that you speak on this topic without mentioning with a single word the responsibility of the Russian dictator Putin for this war? Aren't you ashamed?
Señor Bütikofer.
Mr. Bütikofer, we have denounced illegal interference of Russia in Ukraine since the outset. But repeating a lie many times doesn't make it more true. I'll be honest, though, what I find shameful is the response of the European institutions and this European Parliament, where it was promised that we would be taking action for Ukrainians, but the only thing we've done is finance a war that is no longer on the front pages in the media. In a few months, this will no longer be on news reports, but millions of people will continue to be displaced and their country has been absolutely destroyed. The EU has not defended European interests here, and we need to invest in a just and sustainable peace.
Andrea Bocskor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It's been 2 years that the war has been going on, and we've only been hearing empty phrases that we support Ukraine as long as it is necessary, and then you continue living your lives when you've left the hemicycle. You're trying to capitalize on a personal tragedy where hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, millions have lost their homes, and they have to live the tragedy and horror of war day by day. Young and old, men and women wake up to sirens, and they don't know when they're going to lose their loved ones. This is the side of war that I see. They're drafting soldiers and burying them, including among themselves ethnic Hungarians. We need to put an end to this. We need peace. We need peace talks. A lasting peace deal is the only solution. And you must end with your false lies about Hungary. We have said that we support the territorial integrity of Hungary. We have said it all along. We have also come out with negative criticism about Russian invasion. We support life, future and peace.
The next speaker is Mr. David McAllister, please.
Mr. President, Madam Minister, Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, late in the evening yesterday, it was actually just before midnight, we concluded the trilogue on the Ukraine facility. We can now provide Ukraine with predictable financing throughout 2024 and beyond. This is good news, and I would like to thank all colleagues engaged in these procedures. Michael Gahler, one of the co-rapporteurs, is present. With a total of 50 billion euros, and by the way, dear Council, dear Commission representatives, to be complemented also by the proceeds of Russian frozen assets. The Ukraine facility gives us maximum flexibility with regard to the annual distribution of loans, grants and guarantees. Colleagues, this agreement is a vital step in our support of Ukraine against the Russian aggressor. Despite seeming relentless, Russia is failing on multiple objectives. I can only underline what Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in remarkably clear words. This war for Russia is primarily a military failure. Russia's failure is also economic. And finally, Russia's failure is also diplomatic. Ukraine can prevail victorious, but we must continue to empower their resistance, especially now that Russia is stepping up its attacks on civilian infrastructure, trying to demoralize the brave Ukrainian people. In the EU, we must not lose sight of this sense of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McAllister. Next speaker is Mr. Wojciech Cimochevich, please.
Mr. Chair, it's been 2 years since the full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine started. It's been 2 years of heroic defense of Ukraine and Europe. It's been 2 years of unprecedented help for Ukraine and Ukrainians by the democratic world. But it's also 2 years of maneuvers by opportunistic political leaders who have done a lot not to let Russia be defeated and have not done the right things in the right time. And that policy continues with protecting aggressors' frozen assets against confiscation and using them to support the victim. It's a shame that instead of confiscation, misleading formulas are invented, offering to Ukraine a fraction of what can be given. It's a shame that US Congress blocks necessary arms and ammunition supplies, betraying Ukrainian soldiers facing growing Russian pressure. Once again in history, it's a choice between law and peace on the one hand and disgrace and war on the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next speaker is Ms. Hilde Woutmans, please.
Dank u wel, collega's.
Thank you. Colleagues, the message sent by the European Council last week was crystal clear. Support to Ukraine in the long term. This support is crucial. But arms and munitions need to get to Ukraine so that Ukraine can prevail. With 2 years of war, it appears that in some countries there's been more fine words than delivery of arms. They need munitions. We need action. This is the crucial point. The promises are easy. You can promise millions of munitions, but we need the delivery. They need to get there. That's the vital thing. They still don't have enough weapons to defend themselves. And it's too little, too late in many ways, I'm terribly sorry to say. We need to have joint procurement of defence materials. We need to strengthen the European defence industry. And as I've said before, we need a European army. Former UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill said in 1950, we need a European army. The time has come for us to do that.
Please.
Panie Przewodniczący, Pani Komisarz.
President, Madam Commissioner, this is a very serious debate indeed. I'm very sorry to see that Mrs. von der Leyen is not with us until the very end of this debate. Thank you very much for your declarations and statements. Words are not as expensive and they are not as heavy as deeds. I don't understand why aren't we making the sanction system more watertight? Why is part of the West still making deals with Russia? I can understand that we're talking about Swiss, Taiwanese or American companies, but we also have European companies in this who are participating in this game and thus assisting Russia. So if a large part of semiconductors that the Russian army needs are exported from the West towards Russia, if Russian soldiers are killing Ukrainians and they wear Western boots, we need to think about it long and hard. Why is that so?
At the farmers' protest last week outside the Parliament, a banner read, "You promised peace, you promised us prosperity, you have delivered war and poverty." Why are we still facilitating this senseless and bloody war in Ukraine? Why did NATO block the peace deal that we knew had both Ukrainian and Russian backing in March 2022? For 2 years, your decisions on Ukraine are based on the idea that Ukraine is going to win. Well, it's not looking great. Zelensky said at the weekend the war is in a stalemate. They have a mobilisation crisis. The conscription age has been lowered to 25. Videos abound of young men being kidnapped off the streets and forced to the front. Who's going to fight your war? Corruption is off the charts. Zelensky is about to sack his popular commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Zaluzhny, and a raft of top government officials. The wheels are coming off. The war is crippling the EU. Why on earth are we not making the aid conditional on peace? This is absolute insanity. About time you copped on to yourselves.
Next speaker is Mr. Andrius Kubilius, please.
Dear colleagues, Ukrainians for 2 years, with a lot of sacrifice, defend not only their country, but also all of us, including Mr. Wallace. The victory of Ukraine depends on our political will to deliver what is needed for victory. Ukrainians are not failing with their bravery and sacrifice. We are failing with our assistance. Our assistance during those 2 years allowed Ukraine not to lose the war, but it was too short for the victory. Let's remember, last year Russia managed to spend for its war more than 100 billion euros, and the Ukrainian side, with all our assistance, got only 80 billion euros. All the EU military assistance during last year reached less than 0.1% of EU GDP. We do not look serious with such numbers. The problem is that all our assistance depends on individual voluntary decision of each member state how much to support. Such an arrangement does not produce enough of support. We have example of our collective approach, the European Union Plan for Munition Delivery. Despite its shortcomings, it is a good example of how the EU needs to act. We need to have the EU plan for the victory of Ukraine, which would cover all the military needs of Ukraine, not only artillery shells. Such a plan should start from the obligation of each member state to deliver military assistance not less than 0.25% of national GDP, like Sven Mikser has said before. It would allow to significantly increase military production both in Ukraine and in the EU. That is how Ukraine would start to prevail. Victory of Ukraine is needed for us, and let's make it. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much, Mr. Kubilius. Next speaker is Mr. Tonino Pizzula.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, our support for Ukraine is as important as it was on the day one of the Russian aggression. Though the situation at the battlefield is a stalemate, the European Union has proven that it will be forged in the crisis, as Jean Monnet said. Just see the collective defence efforts, energy imports and sanctions, but we need to do more. The Council's decision last week is a strong message from the European Union in all directions. To Ukraine, which is fighting for freedom, to Russia, which counted on the fatigue of the EU with the war and perhaps on its general collapse, but also to Washington, that the European Union doesn't give up its efforts for Kyiv, and as the United States must also overcome internal divisions and to continue supporting Ukraine. With this decision, European Union engagement gains new momentum. In this super-election year, the European Union should confirm at a global level that it's still a relevant significance. Slava Ukraini.
Merci, Monsieur Pizzula. Et la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Pizzula. I now give the floor to Mr. Bernard Guetta.
Chers collègues, il comptait en...
Colleagues, he thought he'd be entering Kyiv in 3 days, and what's the situation now? 2 years on, and Putin controls only 17.5% of Ukrainian territory, and he's not even able to maintain control of the Black Sea and Crimea. This is referred to as a defeat, but how do we help the Ukrainians to turn this into a victory? Well, our 27 leaders must decide to tell our nations that we are at war. We're not about to march on Moscow, but we're fighting a war for the freedom of our peoples and stability on our continent. And this war demands serious sacrifices, a common defence, and that we drum up determination to win. We're not able to do this without our voters really knowing who stands with who. So you, on the far right, come out and say it. Whose side are you really on Putin's or on that of freedom? This is the only condition for Ukrainian victory, because the enemy bears none of the hallmarks of an invincible force.
Vrecionová.
2 roky od agresivního útoku.
2 years. 2 years since the aggressive attack of Putin's horde on Ukraine. Yes, part of our society and probably part of our politicians are getting tired of the fact that we're dealing with what is happening in Ukraine and the consequences for Europe. But fatigue is not the solution. If we don't stop Russia now, it will be someone else's turn next time, and the consequences will be much worse for all of us. That is why we must persevere in supporting Ukraine's heroic struggle. And we must also address all the things that we have neglected over the past decades. 2% of the defence budget must be the absolute minimum for any member state. And we must finally get our defence industry into production. It's not possible for banks to refuse to finance investment in the defence industry. That cannot be. We, as Europe, have not been able to produce enough ammunition. We still have a lot of work to do, but we have no alternative. There is no third way. Ukraine must prevail. And the EU must prevail with Ukraine.
There is Mr. Francisco José Millán Mon.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. These are several years of an illegal and cruel war fought by Russia against Ukraine. We will continue to support this brave country. This is a war of attrition where the supply of ammunition is fundamental. Russians are using projectiles in a much greater quantity than the Ukrainians, 5 times more, but they persist. The Russian munitions production industry is making advances, and that is worrying. As we heard during the Second World War, the European Union must be an arsenal for democracies. Everybody must contribute to military support. We've seen recently that military support from France, Italy, Spain did not go beyond 200 million euros. If we want to help Ukraine, we need to support the European defence industry. Especially because we know who will be taking the White House in 10 months. Last week, we gave the green light to additional aid to Ukraine. And I hope that Washington will do the same and promptly unblock financing for Ukraine. Thank you.
Nächster Redner ist Herr Jens Geier.
Next speaker, Jens Geier. Thank you very much, President. Vice President Shevkovich, colleagues. It's almost 2 years now that Putin is waging war in Europe against the Ukrainian people and its freedom. It's 2 years too much, but our message is clear. We support Ukraine as long as Putin requires us to. I'd like to thank Chancellor Scholz that he's made it possible to have invited Viktor Orban for a cup of coffee. The German government is not just been attacked by the EPP here, that the German contribution to Ukraine was too small. It's always been insufficient, but it's important to note that no other state in the EU is doing any more to support the defensive capabilities of Ukraine than Germany. My request to you would be, colleagues, make sure that your governments redouble their efforts. This also includes, institutionally, not having unanimity in foreign and security decisions in the EU. That would be the main way to face up to blackmailers within, and also for Ukraine to be able to stand up for its sovereignty. Thank you. Mr. Tudorache is the next speaker.
Thank you, Chair, Vice President, dear Minister, dear colleagues. This horrendous war on our continent was not supposed to last that long. Putin thought it would be quick. We thought Ukraine wouldn't stand its ground, and most thought our drive and solidarity as a union wouldn't last either. But here we are in a reality where everyone was wrong in their initial planning, except Ukraine and its brave people who believed in their cause from day one, who fought and died every single of these 700 days. Today, our task must be crystal clear. Ukraine's resilience is non-negotiable. Our peace is no longer a natural given right, and for both of these reasons, we must equip our union with what it takes to become a credible long-term security provider. An articulated defence industrial vision, instruments to deliver it, and a defence commissioner to keep all this together. And now, in the immediate term, we must put our money and weapons where our political mouth is. That is how Ukraine can win this war. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Okay, next speaker is Mr. Dominik Tarczynski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear leftists, it's been 2 years of Putin's attack. And what have you done? Nothing. What have you done, Mr. Weber, as a Germany? What have you done? 5,000 helmets. That's your achievement. Oh, no. You built the Nord Stream 2. And then you block the sanctions. That is the fact. What about Belgium? You are responsible for blocking sanctions on Russian diamonds when we, Polish government, conservative government, was fighting for it. What about Austria? Austria was blocking 12th package of sanctions because one of their banks was on the list of the war sponsors. What about the rest? All you did was just blocking sanctions, and Poland was first to help when Russians attacked. 17 million people crossed Polish-Ukrainian border. So do not lecture us about humanity, about asylums, about refugees, because we do know what the refugee is and what illegal migrant is. I was the first MEP to see massive graves. How many of you visited Ukraine? How many of you visited Lampedusa? I was the one to see illegal migrants. So let's make a deal. You take illegal migrants, we're going to take those who were attacked.
Thank you very
Putin
much.
for some
Next
time.
speaker is Mr. Lukas Mandl.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, it's important and correct that the EU support the Ukrainians in their fight for survival. It's existential for the EU, for Europe, for the whole free world. And 2024 will show that the EU must do this independently. It's also important what the Commission President said on the 1st of March 2022, immediately after the start of the war, in our extraordinary sitting at the European Parliament, that we must reach out and to the other Russia. But we don't know the other Russia, no face, no name, and 2024 won't give us that. We must stand together. We must stand behind Ukraine. The people in Ukraine mustn't have any illusions that it will end quickly or that there'll be a rapid EU membership. Ukraine will be free, Europe will be free, democratic with the rule of law, and every effort makes that worthwhile.
Moretti.
For 2 years now, Ukraine has been defending its territory and citizens against Putin's illegitimate attack very bravely. Russia has threatened not only security and stability in Europe, but our values of peace and democracy underpinning Europe. Putin thought that Ukraine would have collapsed in on itself, but the people with firm support from Europe have not allowed that. From day one, the EU institutions have stood side by side with the Ukrainian resistance in tangible form, 80 billion in financial, humanitarian and military support, The EU decided to stand up and defend democracy, not leave Ukraine at the mercy of an unscrupulous dictator such as Putin. Although some sovereigntist leaders friendly with the Italian leadership wanted to block resources, it's not enough to defend the people of Europe. We have to defend rule of law in Europe. Some still think that they can undermine freedom and the rights of people, and others are indifferent.
Colleagues, due to the delay, I will not take any more blue cards, and I also will close the request for Catch the Eye, and we will continue with Mr. Zdzisław Krasnodębski, please.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Chair. When 2 years ago Russia launched its attack, large-scale attack on Ukraine, Europe was shocked, shaken, although the brutal Russian imperialism has been known in Europe for centuries. It would have been good to look into history and know more about it. Ukrainians surprised us by their determination and courage, but today sentiments and feelings are different, and we must not forget about that. And this is also our fault. Ukraine is sorely missing not only equipment, but also people. The willingness of young Ukrainians to go and fight is decreasing. They prefer to stay abroad, and political rife is growing in Kyiv. We need to do more in this context rather than less. It is very important that the European Council decided to support our help to Ukraine and that they finally decided to think about the use of frozen Russian assets. I would like to congratulate us on this determination, and let us hope that we will not have to wait 2 more years for specific action, concrete action in this respect.
Merci, Monsieur
Thank you, President.
Dear Vice President. Há 2 anos,
2 years ago, Russian troops invaded Kyiv. They invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin was clear. He wanted a Europe controlled by Moscow from Kyiv to Lisbon. This desire on Putin's part has not changed. And therefore, it is crucial 2 years on that the European Union be on the front line of solidarity with the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people. Financial support is crucial. Military support is crucial. Humanitarian support is crucial. And it is fundamental that we move forward with Ukraine's accession process. We must link Ukraine to NATO. Without these pillars, financial support, humanitarian support, military support, integration into the EU and integration into NATO, Europe will be weaker. It will be vulnerable. And Putin and the Russian invaders will have won.
Mr. Rangel. Next speaker is Mr. Thijs Ruiten.
Thank you, President, the Commission, Council, colleagues. Yes, the EU showed unity last week with the Ukraine facility in support of the brave Ukrainians fighting also on our behalf for our democracy. But make no mistake, Orban held the other 26 hostage for way too long, and it is an illusion to think he will stop. He delayed and blackmailed you into unlawfully unfreezing 10 billion euros. Sort it, use Article 7, suspend the presidency, because autocrats will never stop unless we stop them. Putin will not stop either unless we give Ukraine the military support it needs to win, not just what it needs not to lose. But the differences in bilateral military aid by member states are inexplicable and frankly unacceptable. Send the ammunition, send the jets, send the ATACMS. Ukraine must be able to neutralize Russian positions from where it is attacked. Ukraine must win. Slava Ukraina.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Ruiten. Next speaker is Mr. Alexander Alexandrov-Yordanov.
Уважаемый господин председател.
Thank you, President.
I should say that I really welcome the agreement in the European Council to continue to support Ukraine in all areas. This determination should continue till Russian aggressors have been chased away. We need determined action. Russia should really be made to experience the whole horror of the war that it started. Russia should be totally isolated. Perhaps it is time to think about putting a stop to any diplomatic relations with Russia, because according to the Convention, these relations should be based on friendship and cooperation. However, we cannot have relations of cooperation and friendship with Putin. We are not Orban. It's clear that we should also be led by principles, values, and morality. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. I shall now give the floor to Raphael Glucksmann. Thank you. Colleagues, we thought that Europe had woken up 2 years ago from our somnolence and stupor in Europe. We thought our eyes were open now, but unfortunately the sleepwalkers are still in their perpetual lethargy for 2 years now. How is it possible that the 200 billion euro of Russian money frozen in our banks should not have been seized yet? What about the lack of munitions for the Ukrainian forces? We've been promising that we will use what we can save to support that war effort. We're looking at 10,000 per day supplied to the front, which is pathetic. We say that we will support Ukraine, we say that we will show solidarity, but it's actually realpolitik and self-interest. In Donbass and Crimea, it was a different issue. This is against Europe itself. This is against us. But that alarm call has not been heeded. Slava Ukraini, vive l'Europe.
Mr. Glucksmann, next speaker is Ms. Jelena Zovko, please.
Thank you very much, dear President. Pozdravljam najnoviju odluku Europskog.
I welcome the recent decision of the European Council to grant aid to Ukraine and the conclusion of a trialogue which happened yesterday here in Parliament. And the Ukraine has bravely sustained many sacrifices for the Ukraine to be able to go on the path of its European future. We are very well aware as Croatians of the fight that's required for democracy and our values. With President Tudjman, we faced many obstacles and the lack of support of the then weak Europe. Croatia was able to defend not only itself but prevent further massacre in Bosnia and Herzegovina and also bring about the Dayton Accord and the peaceful reintegration of the area around the Danube, although there have been many suspicions as to whether that could be achieved. We have fought against autocratic regimes and those who think that Putin will have a smooth path towards achieving his objectives are wrong. So don't let history judge us because we're being conformist. Thank you.
Colleagues, we are having a very important debate here, so I ask the colleagues entering the room not to engage into conversations and take a seat, please. Next speaker is Mr. Eero Heinäluoma.
Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine continues. With its attack, the Russian leadership has abandoned all the country's principal commitments and placed itself outside normal European and international cooperation. The Ukrainian people are fighting heroically for their self-determination, but also for the freedom of all Europeans. Our task is to support Ukraine with everything we have. The European Union must help by financial, humanitarian and military means. The Russian leadership must realize that they will be held responsible for their war of aggression and human rights violations. They will have to make good all the destruction and all the damage they are guilty of in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting in difficult and challenging conditions. Our promise of a European connection, European Union membership, is important in showing the way for Ukraine. We understand the difficult conditions of war, and we also trust that the EU membership path will help Ukraine to make the necessary reforms, commit to democracy and citizens' freedoms, and a society free of corruption.
Very much. Next speaker is Mr. Tomasz Siderowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bucha, Mariupol, Bakhmut. To jsou jména ukrajinských měst, kterých jsme se my všichni.
These are names of European cities, and we learned how to pronounce these names correctly bit by bit, because these are cities where atrocities were committed by the Russian army. Rape, murder, aggression. This shows what Putin's regime is. It threatens not just Ukraine, but European democracy as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, for 2 years we have been talking, and we've been saying that we need to support Ukraine. Let us finally do something. Time is running out, and the time for talking is over. It is time for action, and we have to show Ukraine that we stick to our word and that we count on Ukraine as a future member of the European Union.
Marina Kaljurand.
Thank you, President, Vice President, Council, colleagues. Mul on täna 3 sõnumit. Esiteks.
I have 3 key messages. 1, the war in Ukraine must come to an end by a victory for Ukraine and under Ukraine's conditions. Putin and his cronies, all the war criminals, must face the responsibility for their actions. It is only thus that we will be able to stop this criminal onslaught and show that international law prevails. 2, it's an excellent decision to allocate these resources to Ukraine, but it's not enough. All member states need to increase their bilateral support to Ukraine too. If Estonia can do it and give 1.5% of GDP, why can't everyone else? Solidarity. It is expensive to wage war, but what about the loss of life? Which is the alternative? The loss of Ukrainian lives. The EU may sometimes be bureaucratic, drag its feet, but last week we saw that the EU can unanimously provide support for Ukraine. Dear Ukrainians, you have friends here. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Mr. President.
712. That's as many days as have passed since the attack of Russia on Ukraine. This is an unprecedented attack upon a free sovereign state, which started really 10 years ago when Putin's empire decided to take over Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk. We see where it leads us as we negotiate with an aggressor. This was an attack upon Europe, upon our continent, upon a fight against our love of freedom. Ukrainians are still proving that they have opted for the European way of living rather than the Russian peace, as it is called. Ourselves, as the European Union, need to maintain alive the memory of what happens if we contribute to evil and to the acting of the evil forces, how evil can change the world. We must never ever forget this in Europe. We must never tire fighting against evil. Slava Ukraini.
Next speaker is Mr. Teras Rio, please.
Thank you, Vice President. Dear colleagues, not a day goes by without Russia causing death and pain all across Ukraine. 2 years of full-scale war on European soil. Europe has moved slowly, very slowly, from ignorant state of mind to the state of alert. I believe it has been a very costly lesson. The Council decision regarding 50 billion aid package last week was a much appreciated lifeline for Ukraine, but we need more. It's merely 1/6 of what Ukraine needs in the coming 4 years. The war, this particular war, cannot be won by sending obsolete military equipment to Ukraine, but military technological supremacy, and that costs money. Therefore, Estonia calls for an initiative of 0.25% of the GDP allocated for Ukraine, which equals 120 billion euros military aid annually. Together, we can outpower the aggressor. I have no doubt about it. This is for our own security and for our own way of life. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much. And we're now coming to the Catch the Eye, and I have too many speakers, unfortunately, on my list, so I'll take them to the order as they asked the floor, as they pushed the button to request the Catch the Eye, and I will take two of each group if there is 2 speakers per group. So the first one is Michaela Šojdrová, please.
Dámy a pánové, Ukrajina nám ukázala obrovské...
Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine has shown great persistence in its fight for freedom. Thousands of young men have died, but they will not be forgotten. As well as hundreds of athletes who have defended their country, who have been killed or injured and who will not be able to participate in the Olympic Games. We know their faces, and I hope that at least their photos will be shown symbolically in Paris. It is unacceptable that their assassins can participate in the Olympic Games, and that is why we are appealing to banning Russian participation. Let us not forget the thousands of children, too, who were brought to Russia for Russification. We will continue to work towards their repatriation. Russia has no right to steal children. We must show greater willingness to help Ukraine so that their victims are not lost in vain.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. On the 24th of February, it will be the 2-year anniversary of this unfair, cruel invasion that put Ukraine and the EU under unprecedented pressure. But it has also shown our institutions' solidarity and strength. This new agreement, the Ukraine facility, the 50 billion up to 2027, will allow us to better meet the needs for reconstruction and post-war modernization. This should go to the different regions of Ukraine and those who are responsible for reconstruction. Local and regional administrations, as well as national administrations, need to be at the heart there. We need to give them the help they need. But don't forget, the funding really needs to get to those who need it most. It has to be a sustainable, inclusive reconstruction.
Speaker is Ms. Emma Wiesner.
We have done too little to support Ukraine. I'm embarrassed that our colleagues in Kyiv are sat there waiting to see what mood Viktor Orban is in today, to see if they will get support from the EU leadership or not. We have done too little and we must do more. Ukraine deserves long-term and stable support from the whole of the European Union, and this must be done as long as it takes Every country must guarantee to deliver support as long as the war continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Claire Daly.
Before Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO was in terminal decline. The scam of European moral superiority wasn't working. A spent force, discredited by decades of illegal wars, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and then along came Russia and took the bait, and the whole sorry saga went down the memory hole. European leaders parading around, chanting about glory, draped in flags, pretending to care about democracy and international law while slobbering over arms contracts. It's easy to see why you'd want the war to go on, but it's over. And while you're amusing yourselves with your pantomime Churchill act, Ukraine is running out of men and running out of hope. As European economies tank, few believe that victory is around the corner. Even the White House is backing off, and your support for Israel shows you never cared about democracy. It's about handouts to arms companies and the might of the US.
Voorzitter, Oekraïne leidt al...
No, sorry. Kanev. Yeah, Mr. Radan Kanev.
Now it's working. It does not working. It's working. No.
508.
Thank you. It's 2 years after the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, but it's also 10 years after the illegal occupation of Crimea. And let me remind you, it's exactly 20 years after the poisoning of President Yushchenko of Ukraine. And I think 20 years later, even the so-called useful idiots in this hemicycle must clearly see the intentions of the imperial regime in the Kremlin. But even more importantly, it must be clear what our pragmatic interest as nations and united Europe is. And it is that defending the independence and the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine is the interest of our own national security. And furthermore, that isolating Russia economically is our clear interest of our economic independence. You know, a lot of Russian propagandists say Russia doesn't like meddling in its backyard. But in the imperial mentality in Kremlin, their backyard includes not only Sofia and Bucharest, but also Berlin and Moscow. Thank you.
The last speaker is Mr. Joasas Olekas.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, we are grateful to Ukrainians for defending our values and the future of our children against the Russian aggression. It was really shameful where for 2 months we could not agree on support to Ukraine. Today we have a decision on the 50 billion facility for Ukraine, but we all understand it's too little. Colleagues have mentioned that we are not using the 300 billion of frozen Russian assets. Our sanctions are not effective enough. Another shameful, almost legal trade is 200 billion of trade with Russia. Some Ukrainian and Lithuanian experts proposed to the Commission to levy a war tax on this illegal trade, and I would like to invite the Council to consider this.
Very much, and now the floor goes back to the Commission, and I see it's Commission Executive Vice President Šefčovič. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Madam Minister, honourable members. I'm sure that we all vividly remember our extraordinary session of plenary in Brussels taking place a few days after Russian invasion in Ukraine. And I recall our common shock and horror that after long decades of peace, war has returned back to Europe. As you recall, we've listened to the video link address of President Zelensky and have been impressed by his determination to fight the invaders, to defend the liberty and sovereignty of his country. I believe that that was that moment when this unbreakable bond between the European Union and Ukraine was firmly established. At that time, we couldn't imagine the level of human suffering, the scale of tragic loss of lives and destruction brought by war. At that time, we couldn't imagine neither the bravery of Ukrainian people, but also the level and strength of European solidarity, unity and resilience. We couldn't expect the rapid enlargement of NATO and the vigor of the enlargement process where Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia and Western Balkan countries are now firmly on the path to become the EU member states. The decision of the European Council on the 15 billion euros of Ukrainian facility, which we discussed at the previous debate, confirms that the EU will stay shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and Ukrainians, and that we will do that as long as it takes. And this debate, honourable members, sends another strong message of support and solidarity to Ukraine, and for that I really would like to thank you.
Madame la Ministre Hadja.
Minister Lakbib, you have the floor.
Vice-Président, Monsieur.
Vice President, Commissioner Šefčovič, honourable members of the European Parliament. Since the Russian aggression, Ukraine has shown unflinching resistance. They deserve our admiration and respect for that. Throughout this conflict, the EU has shown itself to be the closest ally of Ukraine, providing unprecedented levels of support, both in terms of content and scope. I had the opportunity to talk about that in my earlier speech. Of course, the scope for improvement, we need to take account of the effect on our internal market. Some of you have spoken about farmers' unhappiness. We need to look at what kind of flexibility and adaptability will be necessary. We have unwavering support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. We need to make that very clear. The recent extraordinary summit of the 1st of February shows that the European Council is willing to follow through. But we need to do more, and we need to be active on several fronts, delivering munitions first and foremost. That needs to speed up. The Ukraine facility is an area where Parliament and Council need to develop the agreement of principle achieved last night. We're at your disposal to sit with Parliament to discuss the MFF to reach an agreement as soon as possible. Military support, the European Council asked Council to come to an agreement by the beginning of March last week for a specific fund for Ukraine, and the work has started on that. A new sanctions package is currently being prepared for the symbolic date of the 24th of February, and I take this opportunity to tell you that the 12th sanctions package will include diamonds. It's already taken effect, and Belgium has worked on the preparation of a mechanism that will allow us to avoid any circumvention of those sanctions, specifically thanks to the involvement of G7 states. Combating circumvention of sanctions is one of our top priorities. We're engaged in awareness raising with third countries. David O'Sullivan, as a special envoy, has been working on this too, and we've also been working on the companies of those third countries. We've already seen some of the results of this in certain countries, and will continue supporting Ukraine and sanctioning Russia for as long as it takes. To conclude, I can state once again that the future of Ukraine, the future of the citizens of Ukraine, lies in the heart of Europe. We will not abandon them. Slava Ukraina, vive l'Europe. Thank you very much, Minister. The debate is closed. The vote will take place at the next session.
Suspend it for a few moments, and it will resume with the votes very, very soon.